eye perceives all things conjoined, the past, the future, and the present. Everything flows, and all is connected. This eye is not merely seeing reality, it is touching the truth. I see what you mean.
This is not a philosophy channel, but it is impossible to approach the big what is without having a bit of a philosophical bent, even if it's only to wax poetic. Nostalgia. What is nostalgia? It is an experience, an individual experience, a shared experience, a collective unconsciousness, a memory of the real, an invented dream. At its core, nostalgia is a feeling, an emotion. And being an emotion, it is primordial and difficult to define. The word nostalgia comes from the Greek words for returning home and pain. There's a deep relationship between nostalgia and homesickness. But what even is home? Ah, but therein lies the rub, Hamlet.
You can't go home again.
Nostalgia is a single feeling which can encompass the entire range of human emotion. In a single stroke, it can impart on us both the deep sorrow of loss and the warm comfort of familiarity, the happiness of a human connection and the isolation of loneliness. Because nostalgia can be such a visceral experience, to label it simply good or bad would be to do it a disservice. Nostalgia is, in simplest terms, a trip. I'm a millennial, which is itself, depending on the person using it, a title loaded with meanings both good and bad. However, of all the things that could and have been said about millennials, one everyone agrees on is that my generation is deeply nostalgic. Even back in 2008, the year I graduated high school and an effective lifetime ago, we were making jokes about all the things that only 90s kids remember. A joke which, of course, hasn't grown stale in the 12 years since. That was probably about the time millennials started becoming old enough to actively contribute to the cultural zeitgeist, and when they did, they took that same attitude and adapted it to the 2010s, making for a decade of art and media which might well be described as a renaissance of 80s and 90s aesthetic. And it's not just the big commercial examples people tend to think of. Stranger Things is great and all, but it's just a piece of the resurgence. Crop tops and chokers are back, as are Doom and Wolfenstein, to say nothing of the various internet subcultures on which this video is based. Vaporwave, synthwave, all your various waves really. Neon-choked sunsets and looping hand-drawn anime gifs. Remixes that make modern songs smell of Aquatic and Marlboro Miles. Nostalgia for the 80s and 90s casts a lo-fi shadow over internet culture that's hard to escape, and it does so because it brings a comfort that can't really be found elsewhere. Not that there are no other forms of comfort, but the comfort embedded within 80s and 90s nostalgia is nicotine yellow, incandescent, and above all, unique. For myself and others born between 1981 and 1996, nostalgia for that era is an example of personal nostalgia. We have real, lived experiences rooted both in the period itself and all the cultural trappings entailed by it. I remember when anime looked like this. Remember when commercials looked like this. Remember when music sounded like...
These dreams go on when I close my eyes.
Was life better in the 90s? Not exactly, especially for some people. The AIDS pandemic and the stigma associated with the gay plague certainly didn't make for a better world for queer people, for example. But the necessity of healing from trauma means that time has a way of wearing down the rougher edges of memory, leaving only the better parts to reminisce on. I mean, my middle school years were terrible, some of the worst in my life, but even I couldn't help but be nostalgic for that time as I watched Pin 15. Humans are social creatures, and personal nostalgia is absolutely bound within the human need for social connection, largely because humans are also beings bound by time. Nothing lasts forever but the earth and sky and Kansas, and the human experience is one constantly permeated by loss. When we are nostalgic, we remember those people who are no longer with us, and we remember them because we remember the world that was around us at the time. One becomes subconsciously inseparable from the other. Every time I see Dragon Ball Z anything, I am immediately transported back to the playground, sitting atop the monkey bars with Brad and Sean. We would always discuss that week's new episode, speculating on whether Goku really had it within him to defeat Frieza in the end. I never saw Sean or Brad after elementary school. They both moved away before middle school, and thus my memories of them are forever linked with my memories of Dragon Ball Z, my memories of elementary school, my memories of the 90s. It's been over 20 years since I last saw either of them, and in all likelihood, I will never see them again. But I remember the happiness that my friendship with them brought me, and I remember the happiness of that connection because of 90s nostalgia. Memory is imperfect. I don't often dwell on the bullying I endured 2 decades ago, or the shame I was so often made to feel. Rather, I watch Mulan or play Donkey Kong for the 1000th time, wrapping myself in a blanket of nostalgia that can comfort me when nothing else can. Indulging nostalgia is the cure for homesickness, even if that home is misremembered and never really existed in the first place. Being born in 1990 also brings with it some unique considerations. I had just started 6th grade when the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001 occurred, an event that shifted the fundamental paradigm of the culture around me. My middle school and high school years were, at least on a societal level, completely shaped by that single day's events. In a lot of ways, I think that caused people my age to become nostalgic from an earlier age, as the pre-9/11 world always felt more optimistic and innocent than its 2000s successor. Perhaps that's why the 80s and 90s are so popular now. They represent a time before Patriot Act surveillance and 3.4-ounce travel containers. A time before 2 different presidents lost the popular vote but won the electoral vote, and before endless wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. Then again, one did not have to live through the 90s to be nostalgic for it, especially in light of the grimmer realities of the post-9/11 world we live in. One of the stranger things I've encountered as I've gotten older is people who weren't even born until I was in high school expressing nostalgia for the 90s or, God forbid, the early 2000s. Many of us become weirdly defensive about who can and cannot be nostalgic for a certain period of time, gatekeeping our false, rose-tinted memories with only 90s kids remember, as if such exclusionary attitudes somehow make us better. At any rate, being nostalgic for a world one was never a part of takes us from the realm of personal nostalgia and straight to the idea of historical nostalgia. Historical nostalgia is nostalgia on a societal scale. Like personal nostalgia, it is a longing for a home that never existed, but moreover, it is longing for a home that never existed and which one was never even a part of. It's wishing you grew up in Hawkins. It's the feeling you get when you hop into your grandfather's Chevelle and turn the dial to the classic rock station. It's watching Mad Men and longing for the days when all women wore dresses and red lipstick and all men were free to practice casual misogyny.
Today we're going to see a story about one family and how they lived together. About Tony and his dog Fluffy. About his sister Nancy. About Mother who takes good care of the whole family. And about Father who works hard for his family.
Wasn't life simpler back then? Wasn't it more pure, more beautiful, more real? Don't like the world you live in? Pick a different one, a better one, a neon arcade, a smoky disco, a festival of music and free love. None of those strike your fancy? Let's go further. A perfect family in a small town, a white picket fence, 2.5 children, a benevolent, perfect father, a world unblemished, unblighted, unworried, a car made by American hands, designed for American roads, uncluttered by microchips and safety legislation, a mother, always home, always smiling, beautiful and silent. No, further still, a war, a moral rightness, a sense of justice, a country united with the enemies of its enemies. Further, people who knew the value of tradition, a people who knew how to survive, a people uncorrupted by technology and unbalanced social order, people who knew their place, who knew unquestioningly what it was to be an American, man in his highest form, man who had not succumbed to degeneracy, who... Drug analogies are cliché, but escapism is a powerful one when the realities of life become too overbearing. That is, it can be a fantastic distraction or even cathartic when used responsibly. Nostalgia, as a form of escapism, can hold these same properties. Moreover, appreciation for the past is critical for understanding the world around you. Nothing would be here today were the past not there yesterday. And furthermore, I would never advocate for people to forget the ones they lost along the way. However, when one ensconces themselves totally in a weighted nostalgia blanket, it becomes more and more difficult to be fully present in the current reality. Living wholly in the past means that one has no future. It is a deeply unhealthy place to be. I would know. I've spent a lot of time there over the years. Moreover, lest we forget, our memories of our own personal pasts are imperfect, distorted, and softened as the bad stuff sort of just slips away. Personal nostalgia taken to an unhealthy level is simply utopian world building founded entirely on the people we miss and the lost naivete of youth. The stakes, though, are much higher when it comes to historical nostalgia. Nostalgia of any stripe is, by nature, an emotional experience. We bind within our memories of the past both a love for the connections we had and a fondness for the things which were good about a particular point in time. Emotions driven by nostalgia, such as love, loss, happiness, sadness, anger, resentment, hope. Each of these are emotions which, when shared with others, can be unifying forces. This is important because, unlike personal nostalgia, historical nostalgia can exist on a societal level, meaning that those shared emotions are potential points of exploit. This is one reason why the nostalgia for the 80s and 90s discussed earlier is so powerful, regardless of whether or not one has any actual memories of the period. A romanticized past, wherein on a mass level we forget the bad and remember the good, is an incredibly powerful marketing device. And I get it, this world is rotten and is as deeply, tragically flawed as the people who occupy it. An idealized past is, in many ways, a perfect form of escapism. It makes us feel good, and it allows us to forget whatever present difficulties may be plaguing us in our actual lives. And hey, just to be clear, I wholly buy into the fantasy. I've been listening to Vaporwave and Japanese city pop for 2 weeks while working on this video, and if it's not obvious by now, I love Stranger Things. If I could inject the neon straight into my veins to ease the pain, I would. However, it's not just clever media and marketing agencies who have this tool available to them. Nostalgia has also long been weaponized to spread hateful and murderous ideologies, a role to which it is particularly well suited. Historical nostalgia is a fantasy that uses emotion to unify people against the uncertainty of the present. When that present is bad enough, and especially when it causes unpredictability for the future, perhaps due to unstable economies or politicians, or possibly a particularly devastating force of nature, the conditions can become ideal for people to actively seek refuge within the fantasy of historical nostalgia. Those who know their 20th century history know that the mass movements that swept Germany and Italy in the years leading up to the Second World War were fueled primarily by the spread of such historical nostalgia. For those who aren't so into history, here is the briefest of synopses. After the First World War, Germany and Italy suffered massive economic hardship and uncertainty. The Spanish flu pandemic, which hit around the same time, saw further destabilization of governments and economies. Italy was the first of the two nations to use historical nostalgia in order to unify the nation under fascism, and it did so by making the resurrection of the long-dead Roman Empire its primary goal. Granted, the Roman Empire had collapsed some 1500 years before, and so no living Italian had any real experience with what it meant to be a Roman citizen. But that didn't matter. What mattered is that the romanticized collective image of the Roman Empire offered a utopian escape for a people devastated by uncertain times, one in which Italians deserved to be the inheritors of that utopian ideal. Nazi Germany was fast on fascist Italian heels after the Great Depression hit, and while the details differed somewhat, the story was the same. The greatness of the past German Reich ought to be restored, and true Aryan Germans deserve to be its inheritors. Of course, adoption of such ideologies was ruinous for both countries and their people, and was directly responsible for the deaths of tens of millions, some 3% of the entire world population at the time. We tend to associate such exploitation of historical nostalgia with the past, with the Axis powers of the Second World War, but the truth is, it existed before that time, and it continues to exist today. For example, here in the US, nostalgia for the patriotism and purity of the American Revolution was used by American Nazi groups to build their movements in the 1930s. Today, use of outright Nazi symbolism is significantly more stigmatized, but you still see similar tactics used by similar people. Many such far-right groups, for example, often use idealized imagery from the 1950s to show the constructed purity of that time, in contrast with the degeneracy of the present. The early American post-war era is unbelievably fertile ground for hate groups to peddle their ideologies through, as our natural tendencies to forget the bad and remember the good is magnified by the fact that media during that era was already heavily censored to uphold a particular image of what it was to be an American. State propaganda and control of information was likely more powerful then than it was during any other time in our collective history, which completely obfuscates our image of the era today. Moreover, the country was at the height of its global socio-political power and influence after World War II, making mid-century America the perfect candidate for the far right to adopt as a model for utopian historical nostalgia. And it's true, America from the late 40s through the mid-60s really was better for some people. But it's important to ask, better for whom? The so-called Jim Crow laws, under which Black Americans legally had fewer rights than white Americans, were not fully overturned until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
I think if we were honest with ourselves, that we'd admit it would be a bit of a shock if we were told that our sister or daughter was going to marry a colored man.
Homosexuality and queerness were still criminally prosecutable acts until the Stonewall riots of 1969 saw to their eventual decriminalization.
What Jimmy didn't know was that Ralph was sick, a sickness that was not visible like smallpox, but no less dangerous and contagious, a sickness of the mind. You see, Ralph was a homosexual.
And while treatment of women still hasn't reached full parity with men, in the 50s, just 1 to 2% of women were college educated. A life of idealized domesticity was all that was available for half of the country's populace.
I remember your father. The trouble I had with him. Seemed as if nothing I did would interest him until
what, Mother?
Until I discovered how much he enjoyed good food.
For the overwhelming majority of Americans, a return to 1950s idealism would be a complete disaster, as such a world would entail a massive loss of rights, perhaps even persecution for them. However, historical nostalgia works because nostalgia forgets the bad. Oh, sure, some who advocate for such ideologies may say it was worse for some people, but not for you, not for real Americans. And that is absolutely the deadly temptation that far-right hate groups hope to use. Historical nostalgia used in bad faith makes you feel good, makes you feel special, makes you feel as though the reason why life seems so awful now is because we lost our way, and that if we return to that past world, life will be good and right again. But that past world never existed. It's just a fantasy to ease you into complacency. I've never really been one for the idea of a dream home, but if I were to design one, it would at least have these 2 rooms. The first would be a game room with this kind of carpet, black lights overhead, and original cabinets for Killer Instinct, Galaga, Final Fight, and Tempest. The second would be a pink and aqua Kelvinator-clad kitchen. Metal cabinets, chrome accents, a KitchenAid mixer. God, I'd kill for one of those now. Oh, and one of those black cat clocks where the eyes and tail move side to side with each stroke. I wouldn't be me if I weren't nostalgic. This video is not meant to make the sweeping statement that all nostalgia is bad, or that we should never indulge our nostalgic urges. I love original products of the past, and I love their modern recreations. My intended message in this video is as much for me as it is for anyone else. It's okay to trip on nostalgia, but don't become trapped by it. A life lived lamenting the present and escaping to a misremembered, idealized past in order to cope is no way to live, and at its worst, it can actively lead to pain, misery, or even death for other people. Or, in other words, bring back the neon, but leave fascism buried in the ashes.
It's true, Daddy. I did volunteer for farm work.
Brenda, why?
The party convinced me that I should free myself of the lingering bourgeois influence of family life.